Masechet Ketubot Daf Lamed Daled. We're on 33b towards the bottom. Uresh Lakish Amar. We started off this section with the Mishnah that taught about a rapist with a na'ara who has to pay a fine. And the Mishnah mentioned other cases where he has to pay a fine even if he would not be able to marry her. For example, if she's a mamzeret, or if it's related like his sister. Sister would be in Isur Karet. But even though he can't marry her, nevertheless, he does still have to pay the fine. That was our Mishnah. We asked a question up above that there's Mishnah in Makot that says someone who sleeps with his sister gets Makot. And so now we're asking, which one is it? Would he get lashes, or would he have to pay a fine? So we saw a simple answer is to say that they're talking about two different cases. If it's a bogeret, if it's an adult, not a na'ara, and she's consensual, so then there's no payment there. In that case, the man would get lashes, the lashes in place of karet. However, our Mishnah is talking about a case where he has two punishments. He would be liable potentially for lashes for sleeping with his sister, and also the fine for violating a na'ara. And so we are following the opinion that says when you have two punishments, you only get one, including when it's lashes and monetary payment. The monetary payment wins out, and he pays the monetary payment, and so that would be our Mishnah. All right, that's what we've been going along those lines until now. But now we have a new answer. Resh Lakish Amar Hamaneh Rabbi Meir Hi Damar Lokeh U'Meshalem. Resh Lakish says our Mishnah here in Ketubot could be the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says if someone is liable to two punishments, lashes and payment, he actually has to do both. He does not apply the principle of Kimle Bidraba Mine. Okay, so, and that would be why in the case of Makot, so he gets lashes, and here we're saying because he violated her as a na'ara, he also pays. Doesn't mean he doesn't get lashes, he gets lashes and he pays. Good. Now, hold on. We have a question. In our Mishnah, it mentioned different erva relationships that are isure karet. It does not mention if someone violates his daughter, which would be a prohibition of mitah, of betin. So how come it doesn't list that? How come it doesn't list that case? So maybe it's because this does follow Rabbi Meir. But Rabbi Meir thinks that if someone violates his sister, there he would be liable to lashes and payment. And yes, he would get lashes and he would get payment and he would pay. But it doesn't list in the Mishnah daughter, because daughter would be death penalty, and death penalty and payment. He does not say. To be made, says we do apply the principle of kim le b'draba mineh. We only give the more stringent punishment in a case where it's death penalty and payment. So that's why if someone violated his daughter as a na'ara, he would get the death penalty only and not pay. Right, because you only get one of those, and so that's why our Mishnah listed only cases where there is payment, and that's why it didn't list it. So that answer could work. The problem is that Rabbi Meir doesn't think that. Velo, is that true that Rabbi Meir thinks that someone does not gets capital punishment and does not pay? V'atanya ganav v'tavach b'Shabbat, ganav v'tavach la'avodah zara, ganav shor haniskal utvacho, meshalem tashlomei arba v'chamisha, divrei Rabbi Meir, hachamim poterim. Now we're going to compare this to another case where you could be liable to two things at once. If someone steals an ox or a sheep, and he also sells it or slaughters it. So the general rule is, if he does that, right, you have to steal it and either sell it or slaughter it. So now it's not around anymore that you could return it. If it's around, if he has it in his hand and he can return it, then he returns it, he pays double like normal thieves. But if he slaughters it or sells it, then the special law for animals, he has to pay 4 or 5 times. Now here's the thing. Let's say he steals it and he slaughters it on Shabbat. By slaughtering it on Shabbat, he's violating a melacha deoraita of Shabbat and is liable to death penalty. Or let's say he slaughtered it in the name of idolatry. I'm slaughtering this animal and I'm dedicating it to idolatry. That's also a capital punishment. Or if it's an ox that killed someone and deserves stoning. And so, in that case, also, he is not an ox that deserves stoning. One is not allowed to benefit from it, and therefore, when he slaughters it, it has no value. It's condemned to die. So he stole something and slaughtered something that has no value. So why should he have to pay back something that he has that has no value? And so in all these cases, although there would be a reason to say he shouldn't have to pay, the conclusion is he does have to pay 4 and 5 times according to the Bi Meir, but not according to Chachamim. So here our question is from the first 2 cases where someone slaughters the animal on Shabbat or for idolatry, he becomes liable to the death penalty and to pay 4 and 5 at the same time in the same act. And so Chachamim say he doesn't have to pay because he would get only the death penalty and therefore doesn't have to pay. The Bi Meir, who argues, must be because he thinks that one can apply both the death penalty and payment to the same person for one act that he did at the same time. And therefore, how come the Mishnah does not mention a daughter, someone who rapes his daughter? And she's a na'ara, he should also get death penalty and payment. And so that should be included in the Mishnah. Why is it not included in the Mishnah? There's a challenge to Resh Lakish that says our Mishnah is the opinion of the Bi Meir. So we're going to say, answer, Ha itmar Allah, Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Ila, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rabbi Abin, Rabbi El'ah, V'chol Chabaram Bishmed Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, either way, this statement goes back to Rabbi Yochanan. Amri b'tobeach al yedei acher. Oh, when Rabbi Meir says that one has to pay for the animal that he killed on Shabbat or for idolatry, he's talking about a case where the thief is the one that stole the animal, but then he brought it and asked a friend, let's say a friend who was a butcher, to do the shechita on Shabbat or for idolatry. And therefore, since he's not the one that slaughtered it on Shabbat, his friend slaughtered on Shabbat. So his friend will get the death penalty for doing that. And therefore, the thief himself has to pay because the thief himself did not do the act. That's death penalty. Okay, and so that would explain, and in fact, Rabbi Meir does not apply does not think that you can get capital punishment and also monetary payment, and that's why the case of daughter is not in the Mishnah. Hold on. Can you have a case where one person sins, meaning the slaughterer, the butcher, his friend, and then the thief would be liable to pay? The thief is not the one that slaughtered it, right? The classic case is where the thief steals it and also slaughters it. So because he slaughtered it, he has to pay. Why should he have to pay if someone else slaughtered it? Because this is a special case where, yes, indeed, even if someone else does the act, still the thief is liable because the Torah says if he slaughters it or sells it. Now, in order to sell something, you need there to be another party to buy it. There has to be a buyer in order for there to be a seller. And so since the act of selling requires someone else to participate, so we compare the two and say also if it's slaughtered by means of another, that also would make the thief liable to pay 4 and 5. So yes, in fact, that could be, and that's why he pays, because the butcher would be liable to capital punishment, and it would be the thief who has to pay. Or another way to derive a similar law is the word "or," extra word, comes to include by an agent, that if the thief asks someone else to slaughter it, the thief is still liable for the payment. Or another way to derive it is from the word tachat, that he has to pay 4 or 5 for that sheep. That says the word tachat, and that comes to include also the shaliach. So 3 different ways of deriving the same law. All right, so right now we're good, and we sustain the Resh Lakish that says our Mishnah could be talking about a Bi Meir who applies 2 punishments to a person. But now we have a challenge. Matkif la morzutra mika midi ilu avad ihu la mechayev avad shaliach mechayev. Can there be such a case where if the person did it himself, he would not be liable, but if he sends an agent, he is liable? And that's the case here. If the person himself, the thief himself, slaughtered it, then he would not have to pay, because he's liable to capital punishment. But if he asks a friend to slaughter it, then he does have to pay. Does that make sense? That he should get off the hook because he's asking someone else to do it? And the answer is yes, indeed. The reason is, it's not that the thief is not liable. The thief is, in fact, is liable. If the thief does it himself, steals and slaughters it, the thief really is potentially liable to 2 counts, except that we apply the principle. We've been quoting it a lot of times, but here it is where it appears, that dekim le, we establish upon him Rabbah, the greater punishment mine of the 2. And so really he is liable to payment. It's just that we have to kill him. And so we only kill him first. But since he is potentially liable, so it doesn't violate this principle that Mor Zutra asked from. Okay, now okay, so you just explained that Baraita is referring to a case where Hakam Rabbi Meir says he's liable to pay because someone else did the slaughtering. Wait a second, if someone else did the slaughtering, then how can you explain Rabbanan who say that the thief does not have to pay? Right? Why shouldn't the thief have to pay? Since he stole it and someone else slaughtered it. So man chacha, and after all, we said you're liable to pay for 4 and 5, even if you do it by an agent. The slaughtering is by an agent. So we answer man chachamim. Rabbi Shimon hidama shechita she'ena reuya lo shemesh shechita. Rabbi Shimon limits the liability of the killing of the ox or the sheep, and he says that the shechita has to be a kosher shechita, has to be one that allows the animal to be eaten. However, if it's a shechita that's not fit, that is not done in a kosher way, then it's not considered legally shechita for the law of ganav uvetabach, and so he does not have to pay 4 and 5. So good. That's why the Rabbanan here say patur, because you did it on, let's see how it applies to each case. So avodah zarah, if someone slaughters an animal for the sake of idolatry, the animal is not edible, it's prohibited. Also, if someone slaughters an ox that's condemned to death, that ox condemned to death, one cannot get any benefit from it. It has no value, and one's not kosher. And therefore, that shechita in those 2 cases are not considered valid shechita. And that's why the one, therefore, the one who slaughters it would be liable. The one who slaughters it is not considered as if as having slaughtered it, and therefore the thief, no matter who does it, the thief or someone else, would not be liable to 4 and 5. That's the reason. Ela shechitat Shabbat shechita reuyahi. Hold on, but if he did it on Shabbat, although he violated Shabbat and gets capital punishment, the meat is still kosher, right? That's the rule. So in that case, since it is shechita reuya, it was prohibited act, but the shechita is leads to kosher meat. Therefore, it should be considered shechita for the law of stealing as well, and the thief should have to pay 4 and 5. And how do we know that you can eat meat that was slaughtered on Shabbat? Itnan hashochet b'Shabbat u'b'Yom Kippurim af al pi shemitchei b'nafsho shechitato keshera. Someone who slaughters an animal on Shabbat or Yom Kippur is even less severity in Shabbat, even though he is liable to capital punishment, but he can have the meat for his last meal. So that's the question, and their answer is Savad like Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar. So we can follow the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar, who is the most stringent opinion regarding can you benefit from an act that was done on Shabbat. The first opinion is if someone cooks on Shabbat, if they did it by mistake, they forgot it was Shabbat, or they didn't know that this act was not allowed, it can be eaten. If he does it on purpose, then he cannot eat it. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda omer b'shogeg yochal l'mosei Shabbat, b'mezid lo yochal olamit. Rabbi Yehuda is more stringent and says if he did it by mistake, if you cooked on Shabbat by mistake, and then you realize you're not allowed to eat it on Shabbat, you have to wait till after Shabbat. And then you can eat it. But if you do it on purpose, it cannot be eaten forever. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar Omer b'shogeg yachel Mosei Shabbat la'acherim v'lo lo b'mezid lo yachel olamit lo lo v'lo la'acherim. Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar is even more stringent, and he says if you did it by mistake, it can be eaten on after Shabbat is over for others. But the one who actually violated, even though he did so by mistake, he cannot eat it at all. He should not benefit from his own mistake, but it's kosher. Other people can eat it. But if you do it on purpose, it cannot be eaten forever. Not for him and not for anyone else. No one is allowed to eat it. And so unlike the other opinions who were just talking about the person that slaughtered it, that he can't benefit from it, here Rabbi Yochanan says if he slaughtered it on purpose, and that's what we're talking about here in this case, because he gets capital punishment. So he does it on purpose, and it makes the meat unkosher. No one will ever be able to eat this. And therefore the case of Shabbat also is an improper shechita. And since it's improper shechita, one does not pay the 4 and 5, and that would explain why Rabbanan, in that case, even when someone else slaughtered it, the thief himself how come the thief himself doesn't have to pay? That's because it's an improper slaughter. It doesn't lead to kosher meat in any of the 3 cases. All right, now that we mentioned Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar is the most stringent and says no one can ever eat it if it was if food was prepared on Shabbat. My tamad Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar kedidaresh Rabbi Chia apitcha debe nesi'ah. So Rabbi Chia said the following explanation at the entrance of the patriarch's house. He says, "Ushmartem et Shabbat ki kodesh hi lachem." So you should keep Shabbat because it is sacred. Ma kodesh asur b'achila, ma'aseh Shabbat asur b'achila. We're comparing Shabbat to something sacred. Just like something sacred, like sacrificial meat, you cannot eat. So too, something that is done on Shabbat, a melacha that you violated on Shabbat and produce something, is prohibited to eat. Hold on. Now you might think that something that is donated as a sacred item, something you donate to the Beit HaMikdash, you also can't benefit from it. So maybe you'll think that also something that is done on Shabbat, in violation of Shabbat, is also prohibited in having benefit from it. So it's a little different from a sacred item. Sacred items you cannot benefit from, but something done on Shabbat you can benefit from. You just can't eat it. Now, yachol afilu b'shogeg. How about even if it was done by mistake? Would we also prohibit it from being eaten to anyone? Because the pasuk says, same pasuk, it says, and anyone who violates Shabbat will die. So what do you mean? When would you die? Only if you violate it on purpose, but not b'shogeg. So this whole comparison only applies b'mezid. And so this is the source that if something is prepared, food is cooked, or an animal is slaughtered on Shabbat on purpose, it's prohibited not only to the slaughterer, but to everyone, and that is his source. Good. Peligi barav achav rabina chadamar maseh Shabbat deoraita. Chadamar derabanan. Now this very subject of action that desecrates Shabbat, what's the result? Is a machloket among these 2 amoraim. One says that it's prohibited deoraita, as we just said, and one says only derabanan. Naman dama deoraita kedamaran. The verse that they're deriving it from is the one we just quoted. So, and everything makes sense there. Man dama derabanan amar kera kodesh hi kodesh ven maaseh kodesh. The one who says derabanan, what are they going to do with this pasuk? Well, they'll interpret the pasuk differently, and they'll say kodesh hi, that it is sacred, meaning only Shabbat, the day itself is sacred, but an action that's done in violation of Shabbat, where it is not sacred. So the he comes to limit that only Shabbat and actions are not sacred. And therefore, midoraita is permitted, only midrabanan. They came and said, you know what, we don't want people to benefit from something that was done in violation of Shabbat. All right, now that we know that, we bring up the question, ulmanda madrabanan, according to the opinion that says something done in violation of Shabbat is only prohibited midrabanan, but midoraita it's permitted. In that case, when someone violates, a thief steals something, and someone else slaughters it on Shabbat. Now, that meat is permitted midoraita according to this opinion. And so since it's permitted, it's a valid shechita. Since it's a valid tibicha, therefore the thief should have to pay 4 and 5. So how come Rabbanan say he doesn't have to? And the answer is Ki kapatre Rabbanan ashara. Indeed, the rabbis who say you don't have to pay, that applies to the other cases of stoning and idolatry. But the case of Shabbat, indeed, they would say that the thief does have to pay in that case. They were talking about just the majority of the cases. All right. Now, Tobech la'avodah zarah keman deshachat bepurta itesar le. Back to the idolatry case. Why should the person be liable? Now going back to the Bimeir. Why should he be liable to pay according to the Bimeir? After all, think of the steps in the action. If someone slaughters something for the sake of avodah zarah, then the second they make even the smallest cut in the animal, it already becomes idolatrous, and is prohibited. So the prohibition of capital punishment then comes first. Idach ki tabach lav demareka tabach. At that point, the animal becomes given over to idolatry and becomes prohibited. And since it's prohibited, it has no value. It's prohibited from even any benefit. And therefore has no value. Since it has no value, it doesn't belong to anyone anymore. So when he continues and does the rest of the shechita, the rest of the tebicha, so he is slaughtering an animal that doesn't belong, that has no ownership. And therefore, the thief should not have to pay for anything, because this is not a valid shechita. So that's the question, and the answer is Amar Rava be'omer bigmar zevichahu ovda. If he says before he starts cutting, he says I want this shechita to be in the name of idolatry, but not the beginning of the cutting, only the end of the cutting. And so when he does the full shechita and cuts both of the tubes in the neck, only when he completes it, then you will have simultaneously that he will have violated idolatry, capital punishment, and also do the shechita. And at that point, the animal will still be owned by the owner because it didn't become idolatrous yet. So by delaying the trigger for idolatry, that would explain why the thief does have to pay according to the Bimeir, right? That shechita is a valid shechita of an animal that was, in fact, worth something and owned by the original owner. Okay, so now we ask the same question about Shor HaNiskal, Lavdidehu Katabach. Because this is an animal that's condemned to death, so it has zero worth. No one can use it. And therefore, the one is liable to pay 4 and 5 only if he steals and slaughters an animal that has worth, and he stole and is owned by the original owner, and now he destroys it. That's why. But this animal is not owned by the original owner, so why should he be liable to pay 4 and 5 according to the Meir? אמר רבא חמאסקינן כגון שמסרו לשומר והזיק בבית שומר ונגמר דינה בבית שומר וגנבו גנב בבית שומר. So Rabba says we're talking about a case here where it was stolen not from the owner's house, but rather from a watchman's house. So the original owner gave it to a shomer while it was still a fine and happy and non-killing ox. While it was in the house of the custodian, it went and hurt someone or killed someone. And then they took it to court, and they said, you don't physically take the ox to court, but it was dealt with in court. And they said, you know what, this ox is condemned to death. So all this happened while it was still in the watchman's house, and it was stolen from the house of the watchman. Now, how does that help that it was in the watchman's house? As follows. Rabbi Meir, and this assumption of Rabbah agrees with Rabbi Yaakov and with Rabbi Shimon. What do they say? Sabar lak Rabbi Yaakov damar, af mishe nigmar dino, hecheziro shomer lib'alav muchzar. Rabbi Yaakov says that if someone is watching an animal, and during that time that he was being watched, it did something wrong and was condemned to death. The other opinion, the majority opinion, says that Now it's worthless, so the owner has to pay out of his own pocket because he let this happen on his watch. However, the Yaakov says no, since if the animal is still there and is intact, then the watchman can simply return the ox, even though it's a condemned to death ox now and has no purpose and no value. He can say, listen, you gave me the ox, here's the ox back, I'm out. So the Yaakov says one can do that. And furthermore, we add to that, Rabbi Shimon says something that would trigger or cause a monetary gain or loss is like money itself. So even though this thing right now is not worth money, in this case we're talking about the animal that the watchman has is not worth any money, but he can return it and not have to pay. If it's destroyed, then he won't have an ox to give back, and so that will trigger that he will have to pay out of his own pocket. So by combining these two things together, we see that when the thief steals this ox, that even though it's condemned to death, and then he slaughters it, so even though it's something that is not worth anything and therefore is ownerless, but when we combine these two, we see even though it's not worth anything, it's ownerless, still it does have value to the watchman because the watchman can return it instead of having to pay. And even something that is worth potential money is the same as money itself. And so if we combine all these opinions together, then we can explain why Rabbi Meir would hold the person liable would hold the thief liable even in the case of him stealing and slaughtering an ox that was condemned to death. All right, so all that was one line of thinking, but now we're going to see Rabba Amar Leolam Betobeach Al Yedei Atzmo. This whole line of thinking was assuming that the thief stole it and then gave it to someone else to slaughter. And the reason why that helped is because then he's not the same one that's doing both actions. Because if he's doing both actions, then he should only get capital punishment and not have to pay. So that's where we're going this whole time in order to explain to Rabbi Meir. But Rabba says, no, I can explain it even according to the opinion that says, even in assuming it's a case where the thief himself both stole it and slaughtered it. And in fact, Rabbi Meir thinks that one who is liable to two punishments of lashes and payment, yes, that you get both. And that explains our Mishnah, where someone who violated a sister does, she's a na'ara, pays, because you would pay and also get slaughtered. And met mishalem and he does not think that someone who is liable to capital punishment and payment doesn't get both. He gets only capital punishment and he does not have to pay. And so back to our question, in that case, how come regarding the animal he would have to pay if he did both? If he both stole and slaughtered the animal, so he should be liable to capital punishment. So we should apply capital punishment and payment. He should only have to pay. He should only get capital punishment and he should not have to pay. This case of 4 and 5 is an unusual. It's a chidush. It's a new law. Because usually it doesn't make sense. Why should you have to pay 4 and 5? Usually a thief pays double. But this is a special case. It's already exceptional. It's already exceptional in the amount you have to pay this fine, and therefore it's exceptional also in this aspect that here and only here, even those who say that one gets only one punishment, capital punishment, and not payment, in this case, you would in fact get capital punishment and payment as well. We next are going to note that Rabbah is consistent with something else he said. Right, so he just established that according to Rabbah, if someone is liable to the death penalty and to payment at the same time when it's involved in the case of a stolen and slaughtered animal, which he has to pay 4 and 5, then yes, indeed, he gets capital punishment and pays the fine, because the fine is a chidush. We're going to see another place where Rabbah says the same principle of Asda Rabbah le'ta'ameh. Da'amar Rabbah hayagidi ganuv lo utbacho b'Shabbat hayav shekevan yitchayev b'geneva kodem sheyavo lidei isur Shabbat. If someone had a goat that was already stolen, was stolen before Shabbat, and then he slaughters it on Shabbat, he is liable for both, because for capital punishment and to pay. The reason is because he already became liable to the stealing before Shabbat started. In other words, the payment of 4 and 5 has multiple parts to it. The first part is he has to pay back what he stole. That's just the principle of it. And in addition to that is the double, because when you steal anything, you have to pay double. Only afterwards, when he slaughters it, then he has to pay 2 or 3 more times. So in this case, when he stole it, let's say on Friday, at that point already, the monetary liability began. He already has to give back once, if he gives it willingly, twice, if he's caught. And so now that he does the slaughtering on Shabbat, that he's now going to be liable to capital punishment, and the extra monetary punishment is just added on to the tab that he already opened beforehand by stealing it before Shabbat. And so in this case, he is liable to both. Ganav v'tavach b'Shabbat patur she'im en geneba en tebicha ve'en mechira. However, if he stole and slaughtered it on Shabbat, the stealing was also on Shabbat, then he would not have to pay. Why? Because in the act of stealing, let's say he stole the animal by dragging it out of the owner's house, and so then he's moving it from he's transferring from one ownership to another, from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim, for example, and or to his own Reshut HaYachid, whatever it is. So in that case, since the stealing he was never liable to, not even to begin with, because the initial stealing happened together with a capital punishment liability of violation of Shabbat. And so since even in the initial liability to stealing did not take place, so too the added fine for slaughtering it or selling it also does not take place. So in that case, he's liable to capital punishment for the slaughter, but not to payment. We see here that the Resha, the first case when he stole it before Shabbat, is consistent with the view that he just expressed, that according to Rabbi Meir in Rabbah's interpretation, that the fines regard fines in general and fines here regarding the slaughtering of the animal do apply even with capital punishment, and so that's consistent here. The second case, the problem is that even the non-fine, the original amount of compensation that he owes, he was never liable to, and so if he's not liable to stealing in the first place, he can't be liable to the 4 and 5 either. All right, but the first case is consistent with what he said before. Okay, Rabba says the same thing in a slightly different case. We're going to wonder why he needs to say both. If someone had a goat, a stolen goat, he had it from before, and then he goes and as he's tunneling into someone's house as a burglar, he slaughters this goat in the tunnel. He is chayav. So we know the law that if there's a burglar who's coming in the night in a surreptitious way, so then we are afraid that he may be armed, and we assume that the homeowner is going to stand his ground, and therefore, if he stays there, the burglar will threaten his life, and the owner will have to defend himself. And so in this case, because the thief, the burglar, is putting himself into a situation where he is liable to be killed. He can be killed. The homeowner has a right to kill him. Therefore, it's considered as if he is under capital punishment for that moment, right? And once he leaves, if he's running away from the house, then the homeowner cannot run after him and kill him outside the house, but only when he is actually tunneling. He doesn't have to be literally digging a tunnel, but the point is he's breaking into the house. And so in this case, since the animal was already stolen before he came into the house, so he was already liable to pay the principal amount. And now, while he's in the tunnel and he's liable to capital punishment, now he does the slaughtering, and so now the fine is added on. So Rabbah says he has to pay the fine, right? Because once again, this is consistent with this principle that capital punishment and the added fine can be applied together. And the Geneva started already because he stole it beforehand. However, if he found the goat inside, he's in that guy's house, he's stealing his goat, and so he steals it and kills it in the tunnel at the same time. In that case, he would not be liable to pay, because she'im en geneba en tebicha and mechira, because even the initial stealing is not liable to. The initial stealing was done while he is under the death penalty, and therefore he doesn't have to pay the principal amount. So if you don't have to pay the principal amount, that means there was never a guilt of stealing in the first place. If there's no stealing, then there can't be a law applied of slaughtering it or selling it, so there wouldn't be any fine to be applied to be added to. You have to have the base amount in order for the fine to be added to that. So kind of the tab is never open, so therefore it does not apply. So you see, Rabbah has the same law, same structure in these two. So we ask, why does he need to teach both? Well, if you only told me the case of Shabbat, I would say that maybe only in the case of Shabbat is one exempt from payment. We're talking about in the Sefa, where he steals it and kills it on Shabbat. And now Shabbat is, once he violates Shabbat, so he now deserves capital punishment for the rest of his life. Whenever witnesses come, they may come some years later, whenever they come. So he's under capital punishment forever. And so that's, therefore Shabbat is more stringent. Because the capital punishment of Shabbat is more stringent, we might have thought that in that case, he would not have to pay. But aval machteret isur sha'ahu emala. But in the case of when he's tunneling in, so there his liability, his capital punishment is temporary. It's only while he's acting as a burglar inside the house, then he's liable to capital punishment. Once he leaves, no. So this is kind of a lower level of capital punishment. So I might have thought we wouldn't apply the principle that he can't get two punishments at once, because he really never got capital punishment. And so I might think in this case, when he steals it while he's in the tunnel, he would have to pay for the stealing, and therefore also for the fine for slaughtering it, because it's not really capital punishment in this case. So that's why he has to tell me the case of the tunnel. And if you only told me the second case about the burglar, I would say, well, the burglar in a different way is actually more stringent, because you don't have to warn a burglar. The owner, has a right to self-defense, and he doesn't have to warn him and say, hey, you better get out or else I'm going to kill you. The burglar is liable to death even without warning, unlike Shabbat, where you have to give a warning. So I might have thought that the exemption from payment, because he's liable to capital punishment, would only be in the case of the burglar, which is more stringent in that it doesn't even need a warning. But maybe it would not apply to Shabbat, where you also need a warning. So therefore we teach the first case as well. So we need both of these cases. All right. All that was Rabbah, and now we're going to see a similar statement by a next generation Amorah, two generations later, who says something very similar. We're going to wonder why he even needed to say this. Amar Papa, hayta para genuva lo utbacha b'Shabbat hayav shekerva chayav b'geneva kodem she'yavo lidei isur Shabbat. If someone already stole a cow, in this case it's a cow, and he stole it before Shabbat on Friday, and then he slaughtered it on Shabbat, he does have to pay, because his monetary obligation already began before Shabbat started. Before Shabbat started, and therefore, when he slaughtered it on Shabbat, that's just adding the added fine to the already open tab that he has to pay. And so yes, that does apply, even though he's liable to capital punishment. Okay, that case we already had. Here's a new case. If the cow was lent to him, so he borrowed a cow in a way that he can use, So the law is that someone who's renting a cow is liable no matter what happens. For any mishap that happens, any onus that happens, even if it's beyond his control, the renter is liable. So if he rented it, and while he's renting it, on Shabbat, he slaughters it. Well, in that case, patur, he does not have to pay for it. The reason is because he is now stealing it and slaughtering it at the same time on Shabbat. So the act of stealing happened on Shabbat, and since the act of stealing happened together with a capital punishment liability of slaughtering it, therefore he never became liable for payment even of the principal. Never became liable to stealing it, and therefore certainly wouldn't be liable to the added fine. So that's the similar contrasting case as before. Okay, that is Rav Papa. Now Rav Acha, the son of Rava, asks Rav Ashe, why is Rav Papa telling us this? Is he just coming to tell us that the law applies to a cow and not only to an ox and a goat? Obviously, male and female, right? Ox, cow, they're both the same. Applies to goats, applies to cows, applies to oxen. So obviously he's not coming to teach us that. We know that it applies to all of these animals. So why is he saying this? Who is coming to teach us this, the chidush, that it applies to a case of a borrowed or rented cow. I might have thought that since Rav Papa also says that from the time that the renter acquires, right, pulls the animal into his domain, so already from that moment he has to give it sustenance. Okay, so the responsibility of the renter for feeding the animal happens at the moment of his acquiring it. So I might have thought, maybe from the moment that he acquires it, and he acquired it sometime during the week, before Shabbat, maybe from that moment he's already liable for a mishap that may happen to it. And so I might have thought that in this case, it's kind of like the case of stealing it before Shabbat, that he's already liable for paying for it should anything happen, and therefore, since he's already liable from before Shabbat, now on Shabbat when he kills it, it's just adding a fine. So Kamash Malan, that's why he's teaching us that that's not so. Even though it's true, at the time that he acquires the animal, he has to feed it, and he is responsible should something happen, but he's not liable yet until something happens. And so therefore, actually, the liability for paying for the principal and the fine only happen on Shabbat when he actually kills it, and therefore, since it was never stolen, he's never liable to being stolen because there was capital punishment at the same time. Therefore, he does not pay a fine in that case, and that's the added chidush. Okay, last statement of Rava. So while we're talking about rented cows, if a father if someone rented a cow to use, let's say for 1 year, and after 6 months he dies, the father dies, and it's inherited by the children. So the father left a rented cow. So the children can continue the rental period, and so they have another 6 months on the rental period. So the children who inherit it can use the cow. Simple enough. Now meta en chayvin be'onasa. But if it dies by some accident, the children do not have to pay for the mishap, even though the father would have to pay. A renter does have to pay. The chidush here is that the liability for the renter is a personal obligation that the father took upon himself, and that does not transfer. So even though the benefit of a rental transfers to the inheritors, the liability of a rental does not transfer to the inheritors. The owner of this cow would have to go at the time of death and say, hey, you should better know, this is my cow, and have to renew the agreement. Okay. Now, that's the first case of it dying. The second case is if the sons kill it. Let's say they think it's the father's. They don't realize that it was borrowed from someone else, and so they go and slaughter it and eat it, right? Just because they feel like having some steak for dinner. And so in that case, the owner comes and says, hey, that was my cow. Then they have to pay him back the amount that the meat is worth in the cheapest market rate, which the commentaries say is 2/3 of the regular market rate. Because they might say, listen, if we knew we were going to pay the market rate, we wouldn't have slaughtered and eaten meat in the first place. But most people, if you give them a discount of 33%, then they'll say, you know what, okay, I'll have meat for dinner. So therefore, they only have to pay that amount. But now we have the last clause, which is a limitation. We don't know if it's a limitation on the whole Mishnah, the first clause, the second clause. We'll discuss that in a second. Now, if the father left them some property, and property can always be used as a guarantee for any loan, right? If someone borrowed money, if the father borrowed money, then the collector can come and if there's a lien, if it's a written document, for example, then they can come and take the property. So if the father left them property, then that property would be a lien on the cow that was rented, and then they would have to pay the full amount for the, let's say, for the meat that they ate. Okay, now this last statement, some say that it applies to the Resha. When the Resha said that if the kids are allowed to use it, and if it dies, they don't have to pay. Some say that's only true that if it dies on its own, that they don't have to pay if there was no land. But if there was land, then that land already had a lien on it to pay for any possible mishap that would happen to the animal, and therefore they would have to pay if it died. So some people apply to the Resha. Others say, no, it applies to the Sefa. When the kids thought it was theirs and they slaughtered and ate it, they have to pay the cheap amount, only 2/3 of the market price. That's only when they didn't have land. But if they have land that's a lien on the value of the rental, then they have to pay a full amount of the meat of the slaughtered animal, because it was already liened to the land was already liened, so the owner of the cow already had access to repayment from the land. Okay, so now so whoever applies it to the first clause, all the more so to the second clause. First of all, it just makes sense structurally. You wouldn't put the limitation clause at the end if it only applied to the first case. And also, if one would have to pay when it dies on its own, right, in which case there's less liability, all the more so when they actually go and kill it, and that would be more liability. So there would certainly you would have to pay from the property that they inherited in the second case, if you agree that they should pay for it in the first case. And according to that interpretation, Rava, it does not agree with Rav Papa, because Rav Papa said that a borrower is liable for accidents only when the incident occurs, which means that I should only be liable to payment at the time of the slaughter. Right? Remember what he just said over here, that if from the time of the acquiring of the cow, one might have thought that one's liable back then. This comes to teach us. That's why he included the second case, that the time of liability does not start from the time that I pull the animal, but rather only from the time that a mishap occurs. So therefore, since in this case, the Resha, when the animal dies, while the animal's in the hands of the children, so we do, according to Rav Papa, the liability starts then. It does not start when the father was alive, right? It doesn't start when he acquires the animal, but only when the mishap occurs. The mishap is the animal dying, and so therefore the land should not have been had a lien on it in order to pay just in case something happens. So, according to the first version that applies it to the Resha as well as the Sefa, that would disagree with Rav Papa. But if we apply it only to the Sefa, they would say, okay, fine, he has to pay, and the lien, he has to pay for it even from the property of the father. If he has property of the father, he has to pay for it. That's only in the second case where they were negligent. I mean, they should have went ahead and checked hey, where's this animal from? Does it belong to us? Does it belong to someone else? So in that case, yes, they have to pay for it from the property of the father. Val resha law, but they would not apply this limitation to the resha. That in the resha, even if the father gave them property, he still does not have to pay. And that would be consistent with Rav Papa, who says that the liability to pay is incurred only at the time of the accident, when the accident happens, and not at the time that the father acquired it, and therefore the land was never liened to the owner, and therefore the sons would not have to pay. And so, according to that interpretation, Rav Papa actually can agree with Rava. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'Amen.